Yes, we can.
Well, hi, my name is Andrew Maxwell. I'm the Bergeron Chair in Technology Entrepreneurship at the Sloan School of Engineering, York University. I'd like to welcome you today to the final in our speaker series that we're doing between BEST and CFAL. And maybe Ali could just quickly introduce yourself, and then I think Victoria is going to do the land acknowledgement before we introduce our esteemed guests.
Good afternoon, this is Ali Asghari from York University CFAL Center. Welcome everybody to this last session of our, but very exciting session of IEEE, the dialogue. Thank you very much. Back to you, Andrew.
So as I said, we have an exciting double header today. My North American terminology growing on me, I think. I like double headers. But before we go into introduce our esteemed speakers, Victoria, please could you do the virtual land acknowledgement?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As we are not all gathered in the same space, we recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precedes the establishments of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous people. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes regions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And so now it's my great pleasure, without further ado, to introduce Professor Stephen Cohen. Stephen is the Senior Vice Dean of Columbia School of Professional Studies, and he also is Director of the Masters of Public Administration in Environmental Science and Policy at Columbia University. He's had a notable career, both particularly for the EPA, but also doing consulting work on issues around sustainability and the environment. And I'm going to introduce him and ask him to share some insights on a realistic transition to environmental sustainability. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you for attending today. If it's possible, I'd like to share my screen. Is that something I can do?
Yes, you can.
Okay. I think you have to enable it. Yeah, it says you've disabled participant screen sharing. So somebody has to enable it.
Yeah.
I think I enabled it. Could you try sharing?
Okay, yep, works now. Can you see my screen? Let me just get to the beginning.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, well, what I want to talk with you about, this is actually a book that I've started to, I'm actually finished with the second draft of it soon. I hope I'll get to have it completely, ready. But I want to talk to you today about what environmental sustainability is, how consumption and production has started to change and will continue to change in a transition to environmental sustainability, how and what we have to do to research, measure, and understand the current state of environmental degradation and the causes of that degradation, and developing a strategy for reducing pollution and growing a renewable resource-based economy. Building public sector infrastructure is necessary to support environmental sustainability. And to do this, we have to actually change the politics, advocacy, and communication of environmental sustainability. There is quite a lot of discussion these days about, I'm sorry, did I just get rid of my screen?
Yeah, you did.
Okay, let me try to do that again. One of the major issues in environmental politics is this issue of scaring people and convincing them that they have to live a different life in order to get to sustainability. I actually believe something very different. So first, let me define what environmental sustainability is. It's a subfield of the overall field of sustainability management, and its focus is on the physical dimensions of sustainability. And what I mean by that are issues like energy efficiency, renewable energy, water, food, green infrastructure, ecology, toxicology, climate, and waste. In other words, you talk a lot about ESG. This is really just the E part of ESG. And part of what's happening in the world is that the nature of production and consumption is changing, and really what people do in the economy is changing. And I admit I have a US focus to this. 80% of the United States GDP is in the service economy now. 100 years ago, most of what the economy was about was food, clothing, and shelter. In 1900, 40% of the United States worked in agriculture. Last year, that was 1%. And so we need to understand that the nature of consumption is changing, but the idea that we can shut down an economy or slow down an economy or slow down growth is simply not feasible. There are certain things everybody needs: food, clothing, shelter, water, air, and so on. But one of the issues to be thinking about is, what do people spend their time doing? And what's happening to the economy? And the economy is increasingly global despite the politics and despite climate change, despite the war. It's still a global economy, and that's not going to go away. And it's what I call a brain-based economy. More and more wealth is in, let's call it, the software of the economy rather than the hardware. Increases in GDP are mostly in services, ideas, communication, and non-material items. And more of our economy is automated, and making food, clothing, and shelter is a smaller portion of the GDP than it was 50 years ago. So if we spend more of our time engaged in education, culture, and entertainment, we actually will spend less of our time consuming and possibly destroying nature. And so the nature of production and consumption is changing. 3 points to think about: one, the concept of extended producer responsibility, where producers become responsible for the life cycle of their product. The second issue is the growth of the sharing economy. And the third concept is the growing understanding and advocacy of the circular economy. The sharing economy, peer-to-peer markets, essentially enabled by the smartphone. The nature of consumption is changing. When I was young, owning a motor vehicle and showing it off to your friends was considered socially acceptable. Now, more and more young people are thinking, why would I want to maintain a motor vehicle when I can get around in a ride share? Why would I want to park it and insure it and maintain it? More and more of the culture focuses on experience instead of possession. Now, this is only beginning. It's by no means a majority phenomenon, but the very idea of it is a new and interesting part of consumption. We have here in New York a company called Rent the Runway. And what they do is they rent to women largely party clothes and also professional attire, which you subscribe to. And so rather than owning fashionable clothing, you rent it on a subscription basis, a concept that would have been incredibly unusual 30 or 40 years ago. And then there's the issue of the circular economy, which is that everything that goes into the economy, all the material, comes out into new production. We're beginning to see the start of that with using food waste to send to anaerobic digesters that turn that food waste largely into fertilizer to grow more food. So these are the basic concepts. So to do this, we need to understand more about the current state of environmental degradation and their causes, and we need to develop and implement a strategy for reducing pollution and growing renewable resource-based economic life. We have to build public infrastructure to support this, particularly in energy and water, and especially in waste management. In essence, we have to figure out a way to mine waste for resources in the future. And finally, we have to change the politics, advocacy, and communication of environmental sustainability. A lot of my colleagues at the Climate School and the Earth Institute here at Columbia think we have to somehow shut down the economy, that somehow we have to live alone in the dark with a candle. It's not going to happen. Partially, essentially it's politically infeasible. People who have means don't want to give it up, and people in the developing world who can now see how people live in the developed world because of the internet want those things, and not having them achieve it will be incredibly politically destabilizing. So we need to do these things. First, we need to know more about the planet itself. We know more about the human body and its science than we do about the planet we live on. We have the issue of climate change, which is obvious. The persistence of plastics and toxics throughout the ecosphere, which has been accelerating since the end of World War II, deforestation, the loss of biodiversity, pollution, and then what we've experienced the last couple of years, infectious diseases and invasive species, which are transported by a technology we call air travel. These are issues we need to learn more about. And we need to understand why this is happening. We under-regulate production technologies. The precautionary principle is used for drugs. When we have new drugs, we test them before we use them. A new chemical or a new technology, we don't test. We're all canaries in the coal mine. You know, if there's a negative effect, then maybe we regulate it. That has to change. Mismanaged manufacturing operations where pollution is gratuitously discharged into the environment. An absence of a concern for the planet, particularly among some people. I could think of one person in particular who thinks it's okay to send missiles against nuclear power plants. There is a political pressure for rapid economic development all over the world. That's not going away. An underinvestment in environmental protection technologies. We've actually demonstrated that when we can identify a pollutant we want to reduce, we actually are able to do it. In the United States and in Canada, the air and water is cleaner today than it was 50 years ago. So we know how to apply technology to solve these problems. We just have to do more of it. There is always consumer demand for some products that pollute, and an ignorance of science and environmental impacts, especially among decision makers. Most of the people who run our countries and our corporations have business degrees and law degrees, and probably haven't had a science class since they were in high school. And so we need to develop a strategy for reducing pollution and growing a renewable resource-based economy. First, we need to develop generally accepted sustainability metrics. Now, sustainability is measured by a host of NGOs. There's no agreement on the measures, and often the measurement that a corporation does of its sustainability is done by a company, an NGO that they pay. This was one of the things that in the United States, I often use the analogy of accounting. In the 1920s, when we had a great economic boom here, companies were telling investors how they were doing with absolutely no auditing and no accounting. After the crash, the United States established the Securities and Exchange Commission, and one of the first things they did was establish generally accepted accounting practices. So every corporation had to follow the same rules of reporting, and they were audited, and it was regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So you knew how a company was performing. We need the same kind of measures of environmental sustainability. And so we need to do that. We need the government through grants and tax credits to emphasize additional research on green technologies, particularly batteries and waste sorting facilities. I believe that eventually we are going to take our waste stream, and instead of recycling at the household level, you will send your waste to a central facility which will separate it and mine it of its valuables, and then recycle those valuables, whether they're rare earths or metals or paper or food waste, back into the economy. But we need to provide federal incentives, government incentives for modernizing the electric grid. We've seen now the impact of not having access to fossil fuels because of a war. What we need to do is accelerate the transition to the green economy. Now, many of my colleagues say, well, the technology is already there. Well, it's not. If it was there, we'd be using it. We need better batteries, we need a better smart grid, and we need to provide the capital to allow that to happen. And we need regulation and taxation that encourages and rewards renewable resource use, recycling, and sharing. And that requires public sector infrastructure in energy, water, waste, transportation, communications, and public health. And I add communications and public health because, if anything, COVID-19 has told us we need an active and robust system of public health, because COVID-19 is not going to be the last global pandemic. And we need to invest in communications technology because, interestingly enough, that form of consumption is one of the lowest impact forms of consumption we have. And more people spending more and more of their time on screens has some problems with it socially, but environmentally, it's really not a bad thing at all. We need to focus on energy, renewable energy. We need to build this. And the way I often put it is that, in theory, a renewable energy-based economy is going to be a modern economy with lower prices. You look at fossil fuels, you have to get them out of the ground, you have to ship them, and you have to burn them. Each of those phases costs money and impairs the environment. Solar energy, whether it's delivered through wind, geothermal, or direct sun, the base cost of the energy is zero, and the technology of absorbing that energy, storing it, and turning it into electricity is only coming down in price. Like Moore's law with computers, we're going to see that price go down and down. It's already cheaper than fossil fuels. Eventually, it'll be cheaper and more reliable. We need to continue to do that. A modern energy system will have the great side effect of reducing greenhouse gases. So I think the idea here is a more reliable and lower cost energy system is central to the transition to environmental sustainability. Water is the other issue. In this country, in the United States, we have not been investing in our water infrastructure. It's deteriorating. Recently, the Biden administration was able to get about $1 trillion in for upgrading. This has to continue. Canada is doing a little better than the United States, but the anti-tax fervor in this country has resulted in massive deterioration of these collective systems. And of course, solid waste. The waste stream has to be mined for resources. And the reason for that is that some of the resources we have are geologic and finite, and we have to figure out a way to take those resources and continue to reuse them. This is particularly important in the case of nutrients for food, which can be taken from food waste and from sewage. And of course, transportation, the transition to electric vehicles needs to be funded and paid for. Communications technology in this country, we actually have over 14 million people who are still not connected to the internet. And so just as during the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt pushed rural electrification, which completely changed rural America, we have to do the same thing with broadband. And of course, public health systems. I'm not going to dwell on this except to say that if we're going to have a global economy, which we will continue to have, we have to have a really robust global public health system. COVID-19 could have been contained had the political folks in my country, in Europe, and China not suppressed information about it and taken a more aggressive public health approach. Now, to do this, the politics of environment has to change. Most environmental advocates, shame consumption. I think that's not a useful thing to do. Instead, we need a positive vision of the transition to environmental sustainability. It's going to be capitalist, and it's going to be with a mixed economy. We're going to have both the private and public sector working together, and there needs to be a spirit of cooperation. So I want to conclude by saying that I think we can do this. We need technology, we need collective action, and we have to depolarize environmental policy and provide a positive vision of environmental sustainability, an exciting lifestyle where people can spend more of their time interacting with each other, learning, being entertained, less of their time destroying the planet. So with that, I'll stop and happy to have a conversation about anything I've mentioned.
So, Stephen, thank you so much. I have so many questions. I'm gonna just remind people that if they have a specific question, that they should post it in the chat, and I will try to get to them all in the time that we have available. But one of the things that I'm kind of interested in, I mean, you raise a lot of issues, and the context behind this activity that we're doing is, one, to get people, particularly students, but people in general, more interested in the issues and challenges so that we can make better decisions and we can have more educated discussions. The second part is there's this scholarship that we have, which you have to write an essay called "If You Were Prime Minister of Canada, Things I Would Do to Protect the Environment and the Economy Are." So it's always an interesting challenge. But let me ask you a couple of challenge questions. One is universities and the role of research in universities. Now, I'm continually surprised that many of the research applications that we see in Canada don't focus on sustainability. They allow you to do research in any area you want. In other words, academics tend to say, well, we could do research in anything we want. And yet we know sustainability is such a big challenge, especially environmental sustainability, because you can expand the definition of sustainability across all of the UN SDGs. Do you think our research in universities should be more directed and focused on some of these grand challenges that you talk about? Or do you think that inevitably with academic freedom, that's going to constrain research and actually have a negative effect?
I spent a dozen years as the executive director of Columbia's Earth Institute, which is 700 largely soft money scientists. And what I can say is that their research the research of our scientists goes to where the grant money is. And so if in this country, if the National Science Foundation and NOAA and the Department of Energy and the Defense Department want some work done, our scientists adjust their research agenda to meet those requirements. And what we've seen actually since the Biden administration's come in is that a lot of the research is now focusing on particularly energy and climate change. There's a lot of money in the development of nanotechnology applied to solar cells. There's a fair amount of research right now on battery technology and some on waste sorting. The engineering schools in particular are focused in that. Now, in the Earth Institute and now the Climate School of Columbia, we have a lot of climate scientists. And so one of the big areas that we've been working on is attribution science, where we're trying to figure out what part of an extreme weather event is due to natural cycles and what part is due to human made climate change. And we're actually getting pretty precise at being able to predict it. The idea would be then to be able to predict which storms are going to grow in intensity so we can take defensive measures. So I think that it's an interaction between an individual researcher's own agenda and what the government will put money in. Research universities in the United States depend very heavily on federal resources, particularly through the large agencies in the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health.
So I guess what you're saying is that you have seen, even in the last 12 months, in the US, a bigger focus on some of these issues in the research funding than was prior to that.
Yes, and also one of the things that the new administration's done is they focused US government purchasing on green technologies. Yeah. And so that's, I think one of the more interesting things that's going on right now. So if you can create a private sector market for some of these technologies, then through the government purchasing it, and say something like the electric bus, the Defense Department uses buses and trucks quite a bit. And so now there's a fair amount of work going on to electrify that part of the transportation system. So yeah, I think things are changing.
I saw a challenging article about the US Postal Service and wanting to go electric, but not being allowed to go electric or something?
No, it's the other way around. The idiot running it, who's a holdover from the Trump administration, has decided to not buy electric vehicles. Now,
yeah, that's what I heard.
Right. Federal Express, UPS, all the private companies, Amazon, they're all buying electric vehicles. Why? Because they're going to be much cheaper to run. And since you're most of your money in a vehicle is in operation and maintenance.
No. You just talked about, so I don't know the relationship between the US Postal Service and the government. In Canada, Canada Post is a crown corporation, so effectively it reports into the government, but has an arm's length relationship. But Canada Post is definitely espousing the policies of the government. So I'm just wondering, how can it be that US Postal Service can do something that's not what the government wants?
Yeah, the Postal Service is not directly run by the government. It is a quasi-government organization. And so the Postmaster General has a fixed term of office. Okay. And while this guy won't get reappointed, he is in charge right now. My guess is that this is a decision that will be reversed the minute he's out the door.
Okay. All right. So I've got one other question for you, but in the short term, Cindy said, could you put your last slide up again? There were so many great comments, and we will be sharing. Can we share your slide deck as well afterwards, after the meeting? I know we're going to share the video, but are you okay with sharing the slide deck?
Sure.
Maybe you can just put the last slide up again, and maybe Cindy has a question about it. Is that possible?
Okay. You want me to put that up?
Yeah, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Let's go to the last slide. Is this, no, this slide?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe she has a question about it. We'll come back to it if she has. And raise your hand, Cindy, if you've got a specific question. But I think, so I have another question, and my questions are kind of always framed in something I see that posts, and it kind of jars when I see it. So we have a leadership campaign in Canada for the Conservative Party. And one person who's in that campaign said he wants to create jobs in Canada, and he wants to make sure that all the pipelines that are currently being not done, not implemented because of environmental or land concerns, he's going to cut through all that and get them implemented. So my question is, if you're a government and you have a choice a government could, he's looking at it very simplistically from job creation, if you like. And I have no problem. I mean, I'm all about job creation. But if you look at that choice, if you took all that money and all that time and put it into making solar power more cost effective, or wind power, or more cost effective smaller nuclear power generation, do you think those are the choices that we have to make? In other words, stop spending it on the old way of doing things and starting on the new? And the reason I argue that is I went to a great meeting with the federal government like 20 years ago in Canada, and somebody stood up and said, we put $20 billion in Canada into shipbuilding, and now we don't have any shipyards left. And it was like, we tend as governments to put money into reinforcing old and not taking advantage of new. So have you got any thoughts about how governments can kind of get with the program and support the new rather than the old? Because it's easy to support the old.
Well, I think part of what needs to be understood here, and I think governments are usually a little slow in figuring this out, but so are the rest of us. So we've been in several, I mean, I think of my home city of New York. So New York City started as a trading city. We built the Erie Canal, and we were able to ship produce from the Midwest and from upstate New York to Europe. And that's where the surplus wealth came from, at least in our part of the country. In other parts of the country, it was slavery, but in our part of the country, it was something else. That trading city in the 19th century became a manufacturing city. That Columbia has a building called the Studebaker Building, which was a vertical auto factory. We made, in fact, 47% of the GDP of New York City at the end of World War II was in clothing manufacture. We made 95% of the clothing in the United States. Last year, we made 1%. But here's what happened. We had very active docks on the west side of Manhattan, but containerized shipping made our docks no longer useful, and the value of land in Manhattan made it impossible for manufacturing to compete with other functions. So we evolved, in a sense, from a manufacturing city to a service city with education, finance, media, high tech, all of that coming in, replacing the manufacturing. We just didn't know it was happening. We lost 1 million people in population between 1965 and 75. And in the last 20 years, we gained back, well, we're now 2 million more than we were back then, because we were in this evolution from one city to another, each one built on top of each other. So economic life has been changing with technology, you know, containerized shipping, barcodes, cheap communication, cheap information. All of that's the basis of the global economy. So what's a city's role in the midst of that? New York City's role is far different than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So to your point, extraction industries are not the future, they're the past. Whether it's extracting coal or iron, those used to be where wealth came from. Now, all of those minerals are out there in our production. It's actually cheaper. Tesla's doing this. They've set up a factory to recycle batteries because it's cheaper to mine rare earths from existing batteries than from the planet. So that's the future. And you know, anybody who focuses their investment on extraction industries is really investing in the wealth of the past. And I think, you know, you take a guy like Donald Trump, his idea of economic growth is muscular, you know, coal and steel and all the things that won World War II. Well, you know, that's not where the wealth or the power is anymore. And so, you know, and we can see this with corporate decision making. One of my favorite examples of this is IBM made the first mass-produced PCs. And they literally got out of the business at its height, saying, this is now a commodity. We want to put our brain power into other things that will bring us more return on our human capital. And understanding the modern economic world is essential, and a lot of politicians are the last people to figure it out.
You know, so so first of all, 100% agree with you. I think you made a very interesting comment that, you know, kind of explains why I'm an engineer, which is that I don't think enough of the people that are making the decisions actually understand technology, what you can do with it and where it's going. and therefore they're grounded in the past because that's where they're comfortable. But you know, Cindy did have a question based on your last slide. I think it's a really good one. It says, do you have any suggestions about how we can influence the depolarization and create a positive vision of environmental sustainability? It's like, how do we create a win-win out of this? Because actually, I posted something on LinkedIn where someone was arguing it's one or the other. Oh, they said you couldn't have economic growth and environmental sustainability. And I said, I think that's a win-lose argument. I think you can.
Well, we've actually demonstrated we can. So in the United States, the air and water today is cleaner than it was in 1970 when EPA was created. The reason for that, and the GDP is much larger. So we've made the environment cleaner while growing it. Now people say, well, you exported all your industry. Well, actually, the two largest sources of air pollution are motor vehicles and power plants. And we have more of both of those in the United States than we did in 1970. And so there's no question, by applying technology to pollution control, you can grow the GDP and you can reduce pollution. No question, it's absolutely demonstrated. The idea that you can't do it is ludicrous because we've done it. So one of the issues for environmentalists is they take this sort of moral superiority position. You know, you saw at the last Council of Parties. Well, all those billionaires have their jets lined up, their private jets. I want those guys. I want them on my side. You know, let them fly wherever they want to go to. You know, they can either come to a climate conference, they can go gambling, you know, in Las Vegas. I'd rather they came to the climate conference.
Absolutely. So one of the programs I'm involved in, which is energy transition with the oil industry in Alberta, two of the people I work with on that went to COP26 in Glasgow, and their friends from the oil industry in Alberta were there, and they were basically ostracized by the people because they're from the oil industry. But they were there to try and help the situation. They wanted, they recognize it. So
no, I think it's, you know, if I were running a fossil fuel company right now, I would be trying to redefine myself as an energy company.
Yep.
And in the same way, in the United States, we have a company called AT&T, or we had a company. Now, the second T stood for the telegraph. You know, they redefine them. In fact, you know, even landlines are a smaller and smaller portion of the baby bells business, cell phones, and that's the future. So you can define yourself, well, we're in the landline business, we're in the telegraph business, or we're in the communication business. Now, energy, if anything, has become more and more central to economic life. It's a great business to be in because everything that we do requires it. And so, yeah, so you got to change the fuel. So what? Change it.
So I'm conscious of time. I'm also conscious I haven't let Ali ask any questions. Do you have any questions you would like to ask Professor Asghari?
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. For the interest of time, I think we can move on with Nelson, if you agree. But if Steve stays with us, I can ask my question after. But it's not really important, Steve, if you have to leave.
Okay, so Stephen, I do want to thank you so much for being part of this. I think your insights are great. I think you know, this challenge of what governments do and what they don't do when they, you know, get in the way or out of the way is a really it's a challenging one. And even with people with the best intentions, they can do things that at the end of the day have negative impact. And so, but it is important that becomes part of the dialogue, and it's also important that we recognize that we're kind of in this together. And I think my simple answer to Cindy about how do we do depolarization, well, that's what this speaker series is really meant to be. It's really meant to be a discussion, bringing people with strong opinions, educated, who are trying to address this polarization and find some paths through the middle. And Stephen, you've just given some great examples of what that might be. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I will be able to stay until 1:30, so I'll listen to as much.
Okay. As thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now it's my great pleasure. It's the should we have a 7-inning stretch or something? I don't know. maybe a 1 minute break, but it is my great pleasure to introduce Nelson Switzer, who is based in Toronto, and managing partner of the Climate Innovation Capital. And he's going to tell us a little bit about that, but he's also Professor of Sustainability and Energy at Northwestern University. Is that their main campus, or is that their campus in Toronto?
Oh, that's the Evanston campus. That's the main campus.
The main campus, because I know they now have a campus in Toronto too. Did they follow you?
I was not aware of that. That would have made the travel much easier.
You know what? I mean, it's possible it might be Northeastern. I get confused between them. One of them has a campus in Toronto now, because they were talking to me about some projects. But anyway, yeah. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Maybe tell us a little bit about your background, and then share some insights.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. I've got some slides here that I can certainly put up. Let me know that if you can see it.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we're good. Yeah.
Fantastic, terrific. So like, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to present here and interact with all of you. And it is it's an honor to follow Stephen, Professor Cohen, on this as well. And there were so many. I know everybody took very much to heart many of the comments that Stephen made, but it takes a real experienced expert to be able to refine such a complex transition into such well-crafted and succinct and concise comments. So I had so many reflections as you were going through it, Stephen, so thank you for that. And please expect an email from me following this, because I'd love to talk further. So let me jump in. So again, my name is Nelson. I'm a managing partner here at Climate Innovation Capital. I'll tell you a little bit about Climate Innovation Capital and what we do. Myself, this is all I have been doing for my whole career. So since school, many years ago, I learned very early on that my ambition was to leverage capital markets to solve the world's big and intractable problems. And the problems I focused on were climate change, water, and pollution, which is pretty amazing how all of those things seem to line up today with the I would say, the more prominent environmental issues that we're facing, be it plastic and so on. I held several positions, both within corporate and as advisor to corporates. I was Senior Manager of Environmental Affairs at the Royal Bank of Canada, where I helped launch the RBC Blue Water Fund and First Carbon Trading Desk in North America, and a few very exciting projects, again, about 15 years ago. When I moved on from there, I was head of the Sustainable Business Solutions practice, PwC. And from there, I went to Nestle, where I was Nestle's first chief sustainability officer, initially with the Nestle Waters business, and then Nestle US more broadly, which was very exciting and an incredible opportunity just based on the scope of challenges they had and their ambition to create net shared value. Why don't I transition into what we're going to talk about today, or what I'd like to share today, really, which is about, and I think Stephen sort of mentioned this, but the time for small moves is over. It's big moves only time, and that's why we've set up Climate Innovation Capital. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing here. So our ambition here, as a growth or venture growth fund, is really it's to deliver superior risk-adjusted returns, but it's also, of course, to decarbonize the economy. And there's an important rationale for why the returns need to come with the decarbonization. First of all, our work and our data has shown that investing in the decarbonization side of the economy is actually more profitable and more sustainable than the conventional economy. And that was talked about already. But by doing that and by delivering superior returns, we are very comfortable and confident in knowing that this will be another example to help demonstrate that you can bring that capital to work from the conventional economy and into this transition economy, which is simply so important. And there's two big drivers for this. Obviously, there's the financial and there's the impact side. And if we think about the financial, in January of 22, McKinsey released a report, and this is about the 10th one that has come out from different institutions over the years. But the latest numbers are now showing that the capital deployment required to reach a net zero economy by 2050 is over $250 trillion. And that is a massive, uncountable number. but it's enormous, and it shows just the level of opportunity that exists in the marketplace. And of course, on the other side, when we think about the climate challenge that we are facing, whether you want to call it the climate challenge, the climate crisis, or whatever semantic nomenclature is being used today, we are facing great challenges: flood, drought, fire, disease, displacement, refugees, food security. The list goes on and on. And if you look at the last two reports alone, one, of course, from August, and the more recent one from a few weeks ago, the IPCC has made it very, very clear the level of agreement on where we sit on these issues. So this is not a scientific question mark. This is a relative certainty. So the pairing of that impact along with the financial driver puts together what we think is critically important. So what do we do here? Well, what we talk about is that we're hunting gigacorns. And I myself am a gigacorn hunter. And what that means is we are looking for innovations, technology, solutions that are capable of delivering over 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent reductions while having an enterprise value of greater than $1 billion. So if you think about this, this is a gigaton reducing unicorn. And to put that into context, right now, if we were to just round the numbers, you're looking at about 40 gigatons per year released from our economy. That means if we were to find 40 gigacorns, we would solve the climate crisis. And that's a pretty staggering thing. So I love that relationship. I like the way the numbers play out, but keep in mind what it means to be a gigacorn hunter. So what does the gigacorn hunter look for? Essentially, it's those decarbonization opportunities, technology, solutions, services, and they could be nature-based, they could be tech-based, but they come in basically 3 principal buckets. The first is the notion of reduction. And you think about that as energy efficiency, right? That more efficient process. By unit of mass or of output, you're using less energy and less resources. And that's a very large part of the climate tech ecosystem at the moment. The next is the replacement system. And if you think about delivering your solution by eliminating hydrocarbons or fossil fuels, so the wholesale replacement of a system. So instead of coal-fired generation, you'll have solar farms. Then, of course, there's removal, which I think is some of the most exciting space. Now, what we have in our atmosphere is a certain concentration of carbon dioxide and other gases, and it is at an all-time high. And so we have a need to draw down, to capture and sequester that carbon. And so the removal is actually the delivery of the solution by reducing atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide. So think about direct air capture, carbon capture utilization, carbon capture storage, and so on. So we call this the 3 R's of decarbonization. So why now? Why invest in decarbonization now? I mean, the number of times I've been asked this question is, hey, as an investor, I was burned in 2001, or I was really, burned in 2008 during that clean tech crunch and that clean tech crunch. And what's different now? Well, there's a huge, huge distinction. And where it circles out is, I like to think of it in eras: the pre-Paris era and the post-Paris era. So pre-Paris, we had a robust clean tech economy. And clean technology, a term coined by my friend Nick Parker, clean tech is very interesting. It was developed and devised as a series of technological solutions to solve environmental problems. Incredibly important. Morally, ethically, intellectually, it makes a lot of sense. The challenge when you solve an environmental problem is that you don't necessarily understand the demand to solving a corporate problem. And so when you look at the post-Paris era, where we are now and what we focus on is climate tech. And those are clean tech solutions that actually solve a business issue related to climate, emissions, and mitigation. That distinction is enormous. And here's another way of looking at it. Pre-Paris, you had a significant amount of investment going into clean tech. The challenge was you didn't have much of a demand. And so if you look at this curve, you see pre-Paris, the investment was greater than the demand in the marketplace. But now, with the government commitments, corporate commitments, institutional commitments, asset management commitments, there is a massive market demand for solutions, but there has still only been a limited amount of investment. And so now we've got this huge unfunded demand, which we could see as the opportunity here. And this pairs a little bit with our previous slide, which is that $250 trillion opportunity. Well, right now it's starting at about $2.5 trillion is the expected investment in 22, reaching $4 trillion by 25, and growing to $9.5 trillion by 2030. So big numbers. So there are obviously some important drivers behind this transition. Now, first, we know that decarbonization solutions are cost competitive. And I like to say that the logic of economic gravity is taking hold. Now, we know that the levelized cost of electricity for solar is now lower than that for fossil fuel-based energy production. And that's fantastic. That's going to drive more of that transition. But also, you go to your local Home Depot or Lowe's, an incandescent bulb is now more expensive than an LED bulb. That is a big transition. So even at the retail level, we're starting to see products that outperform conventional and are more affordable. The appetite for carbon neutrality, that has moved incredibly quickly. As I mentioned, corporations, governments, asset managers, making big commitments, bold commitments, and investing and shifting capital. We're also in a place of what I like to refer to as complementary regulation. And let me tell you what that means. A lot of regulation when it comes to environmental issues comes out after the fact. There's a health issue that has come out as a result of a new technology, a new chemical, or something that has been put into the environment, put into practice to a corporation. The government recognizes it, and so they put in place a regulation, sometimes, to reduce harm. And that's the first stage. The second stage, though, is the development of market mechanisms and regulations that drive market development. And those are market-making regulations. But then there's a third stage as well, when there's a technology that's introduced that clearly shows that you can transition something for the better. Often you'll see regulation. And my favorite example, though I think Elon Musk may be on a little bit of a different planet, no pun intended, but what he did that was probably the greatest favor to politicians around the world was demonstrating that the internal combustion engine could in fact be wholly replaced and suitably replaced and affordably replaced by the electric vehicle. And by doing so, he gave the political courage, if you will, to governments around the world to start regulating out the internal combustion engine, or at least regulating the sale of those cars. So by 2025, 2027, depending on market, you will no longer be able to buy an ICE engine or vehicle. Many of us know about the green recovery and all of that capital that's been unleashed. It's about, this number should be updated. I believe it's now $870 billion that has been signed. A lot of that is paired with COVID funding, but nonetheless, or COVID relief. But it's a tremendous amount of capital that has hit the market from governments. Climate risks, they continue to climb. We're seeing ESG interest continuing to climb. There is a great report that comes out from the CDP, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, on an annual basis that is showing that the top performers in carbon disclosure are also outperforming the market and other benchmarks. If you look at Morningstar's reports, their ESG funds are outperforming their conventional funds. And that's another important trend. And the last one, which I've mentioned, but bears repeating, is atmospheric concentrations are at an all-time high. And so we're seeing this transition in climatic forces. We had a day here in Toronto last week that I think was 18 or 19 degrees centigrade. I mean, that's very unusual for us and shouldn't happen. So what's our strategy? So what we do here, and certainly what we push for others that look to invest in this space, is finding opportunities that have the highest decarbonization potential, the greatest financial return, but most importantly, that it can happen in the shortest possible period of time, because we are on a climate clock that is counting down, and we need to watch it and we need to beat it. Where we focus, a lot of our research has shown us that the investment ecosystem, if you will, exists in three principal buckets. The first is the early stage. And you think about those are largely angel, seed, Series A sort of deals, a lot of lab work, a lot of R&D, very, very important work, but it's well-funded for the most part. A lot of government programs, incubators, accelerators, early stage venture funds, and so on, feeding that ecosystem quite handsomely. On the other side of this, we've got a much more mature zone where you've got large asset managers, infrastructure funds, institutional investors, large pension funds. We're talking about high single-digit stable cash flow generating returns from a wind farm or renewable energy farm, for example, and a lot going on there as well. Big money, lower returns, lower risk. But where we saw a real gap in the market was in the middle. How do you get from that early stage, from that Series A, how do you start to grow? So we look at this as the growth zone, and those are those technologies and services that are commercial. So they're in market, they've got customers, technology has been proven, but what they need is they need capital scale. They need knowledge of value creation relative to carbon performance and decarbonization. And in many cases, they also even need networking to help bring themselves to other parts of the market and hit an inflection point and growth. We also look at the 6 sectors. So the UN IPCC has something called the IPCC 6, and it's the 6 sectors that you see here. We look at each one of these sectors, and the reason is because decarbonization solutions, or the enablers that we're looking for, that a gigacorn hunter is really looking for, often cuts across many of these. So while people will talk about the sector verticals in which they're focused, we think of ourselves as actually a horizontal investor, looking at those decarbonization solutions and those enablers that can be applied across. And if you remember, it's those 3 R's of decarbonization that can apply to more than one sector. So, in the case of energy, we're talking about the ability to source and transform and deliver reliable, high quality energy. But how do you do it? By addressing the carbon here. And so we look at these things in 2 ways. One is the total addressable market, which is important for any investor to understand. But the second is what we look at as the total addressable carbon. And we measure that, and we try to segment it to figure out for any opportunity what segment, what is the total addressable carbon it can actually go after. And to give you a little bit more of what that looks like, we have built a rapid scorecard. And this scorecard allows us and a gigacorn hunter to very quickly evaluate and understand, does this have the potential to be a gigacorn, and how successful might it be? So as you can see here, and I hope you can see as I've hit the next one, we take a look at each opportunity and we try to address A, what is the annual carbon reduction potential of this technology or of this solution? How much carbon can it mitigate on a yearly basis? And we try to map that out for at least a 5-year look ahead. We then try to also make sure that we understand what the demand for the decarbonization solution is in the marketplace. Are there customers? Are they buying it? And how big is that market? That melds in very nicely with the next point about how do you make sure that this is a commercial enterprise? So what type of revenue do they have? Is it pilot revenue? A lot of entities will try to pass off pilot revenue as commercial revenue, but is it commercial revenue? How many units are in the market, or what's their ARR look like, and so on, depending if it's a SaaS solution or something else. It's also very important to understand the level of technology risk here. Now, if you've deployed 100,000 units into the marketplace, you've probably de-risked your product fairly well, and that again helps identify that it sits in that growth zone. It's important to understand the operational expertise of each one of these companies as well. So we look at their experience and their capabilities relative to fundamental operational KPIs. Do they understand what accountability means? They understand what good governance means in order to drive performance. We've also built into that framework what we call our carbon KPI framework. And I'll show you a quick flash on that on the next slide, which again is, how do you measure this? The decarbonization, and how do you use it to create value within the enterprise, sustainable value for your enterprise, as well as for the broader economy. And the last question we ask is, what sectors of the economy does this actually address? Some address 1, 2, or more. An investment we just made that we're getting ready to announce actually addresses all 6 in a very significant way, and it's very exciting. I told you I'd tell you a little bit about carbon impact measurements. So something that we do is we look to first measure the carbon reduction potential. As you can see here, we've got a 5-year look ahead example. And we track that ongoing carbon reduction year over year and continue to roll that forward. And then we report that carbon performance to our LPs, to our investors. A lot of them are very interested to know how efficient is their capital at actually decarbonizing the economy. So it's an important part of our philosophy. And here you can see an example with the yellow line showing you the carbon reduction on a year over year basis. But what also becomes really exciting is when you look at the blue stack, which is the cumulative carbon reductions that you're seeing year over year. And in this case, by 2025, there's nearly a 40 million ton reduction, which is exciting stuff. And this comes from a real example from our portfolio. So with that, I mean, that's about all I had on these slides. But I invite you and everybody to be Gigacorn Hunter, and I'm happy to take any of your questions.
So thank you so much. That was some great insights. I think we reckoned this last time we spoke, which was there's a bunch of opportunities that we should talk about, particularly with the work I've been doing in Alberta with the Avatar Innovations, because they're in that early stage space. And anyway, there's a few projects that would be interesting. And I think one of the interesting things for me in the investment field, having had some experience in building some unicorns, is asking the question for the investors that come in the next round, what would you have to see in our early stage venture to be considered for investment? And it's a very good way to frame the progress of the company. And so there's a lot in I'm not sure whether you're aware of this, in the Israeli incubator ecosystem. They have these big funds who sit as partners. And what they do is they say, well, we'll sponsor these guys coming into your incubator, because if they hit these milestones, then they're in our space. They're not in our space yet. And so it's like real options theory. So
yeah, it's funny timing. I'm actually heading to Israel tomorrow.
Oh, well, maybe anyway. We can talk about it anyway. But I think it's interesting, and it's interesting how the government policies have changed there. So I'm going to ask a question. I'm deliberately asking a question well, two questions that maybe both you and Stephen have some thoughts on. The first one comes actually directly from Raymond, and I'm going to mention them both, and then you can choose which order you ask. The influence the oil industry has on decisions, political decisions. In the context of what we're talking about now, we're kind of, how do you, if you want to do something on a Canada-wide basis, how do you overcome the negative behaviors, let's just say, and I'm generalizing because I'm sure some of them are behaving very well, and that they're undertaking, and how do you get them to move from the dark side to the green side? And the second question, which is unrelated but is top of mind for me at the moment, is there seems to be a big issue about international agreements on carbon markets and carbon pricing, etc. And if people are building technologies that are global and scalable, uncertainty about future pricing and demand for carbon credits or whatever is really a challenge. So I'm happy for you to answer either of those questions. If I think Stephen's still on, maybe I'll ask him to pick one of those first. If you'd like to answer one of those, Stephen, and then come back to Nelson and ask.
Sure.
Have I lost Stephen?
Yes, he left. He left at 1:30.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, then questions are for you then, Nelson. Sorry.
Sure. So,
I knew he had to leave early. That's why I was trying to ask him. But no problem. Sorry.
So no, listen. I'm happy to see what I can do to answer. So first on the how do you help oil and gas companies, as it were, transition from one to the next? I think Stephen started answering this question when he said, the first thing you need to do is you need to reframe who you are. And I think we've got a great example here in Canada with Suncor, who for many years has been trying to characterize themselves as an energy company rather than an oil sands company. To some degree of success, I think they've come along there. As a matter of fact, somebody that I used to know who worked there recently said at one point he, as working on behalf of Suncor, was the largest operator of solar in the world. Very interesting fact, right? So
yeah, the guy that actually runs that program for him is in our program at the moment in Alberta. So like the engineers on the planet. Yeah. So they told us that. Yeah. We could believe it.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is really interesting. So, but I think reframing is one, but I think the other is we do face a huge number of political headwinds. I don't think it's necessarily a political push or politicians themselves. I think it's ideologues, unfortunately, who are clicking to an economy that is the past. That's why they call them fossil fuels for a reason. And we need to be thinking about how to reframe it. So my thinking on this, and again, I'm not a political scientist, but my thinking on this has been, we need to frame this the way the Ontario government did when they phased out the coal plants, which is this was not a climate push. It was a health push. When the Ontario government conducted the math to determine, can we really turn off coal plants? Can we afford to turn off coal plants? And what do we have to do? They conducted the math and found, and the numbers I'm sure I got wrong, so I'll just throw out numbers, but it was something along the lines of, we're spending $3 billion a year in healthcare costs because of asthma and other airborne particulate matter related diseases as a result of our coal plants. And so if we shut those off and we were to invest whatever the amount of $2 billion to build other energy infrastructure, we would have a net positive savings. Like this just made great economic sense. And by the way, we're a healthier society. And so I've often thought about that for energy companies as well, which is oil and gas specifically, which is you need to do the reframing. The story has to be reframed on the political and social level. And the oil and gas companies need to get on board with understanding that they do and will need to make a transition. Now, I do believe that oil and gas and even coal will continue to be part of our economy, quite frankly, in my opinion, for far longer than I'd like to see it from a climate perspective, from a health perspective, but it is going to be here. So if it's going to be here, it needs to be done in a manner that is responsible and in a manner that has the minimum footprint. So you see them setting up various operational investment vehicles and so on, focusing on carbon capture and focusing on enhanced efficiency for recovery. And I think that's they feel that's the best they're probably able to do until they actually pull the trigger to say, it's time to make the wholesale change. And what's the example in Europe? Neste, right? So Neste they are a fuel company, but they transitioned from a heavy oil refiner to now what they call themselves as a renewable fuel provider. And so, I think I'm kind of dancing around it because, like I said, I'm not a political scientist, so it's more my opinion than anything else, but there's something to chew on at least.
Yeah, it's interesting. So first of all, I was kind of shocked with the coal power and what they did, but you're absolutely right about how they made the case. I still don't know why they pulled all the buildings down, because I'd have made them into art galleries, just like
yes,
the Tate in London. But the thing that has been missed in that conversation, which really upsets me because I'm a big fan of nuclear power, is the reason we could do that is because we had nuclear power in Ontario. 60% of all Ontario electricity is generated by nuclear and 26% by hydro. So people talk about solar and they talk about wind. They're trivial compared to nuclear and hydro. And so, both of them have disadvantages, both of them have advantages. Yep. But it seems to me like they get bad press.
They do.
I think maybe you and I talked about that on the phone.
We talked about it a little bit. So hydro, and hydro has a little bit, I think, of a. There is still a significant greenhouse gas impact relative to hydro. There is, and I don't think that people acknowledge that, and I think it has to be. I don't know enough about nuclear. I've not studied it, but nuclear has always made me nervous, especially in this province, because of the notion of unmanaged waste. And I remember sitting around the table having this conversation with somebody 15 years ago when they were looking for project financing for a nuclear project. And I asked the question about waste management because my job was environmental risk at the time. And they said, I'm not worried about it because by the time it becomes a problem, engineers will have figured out how to manage it. And I thought that was a very irresponsible statement to make. Yeah, as an engineer, I found that irresponsible.
Yeah, no, so it's a really good point. And so I think that so my research is around how do you bring new technologies to market. That's what I research.
Sure.
And Stephen made a point about that in his presentation, about if we want to see more innovation, then the people doing the technology have to think about these other issues as well. They can't just do it in a vacuum and say it's not my problem. So I absolutely agree with you, and I think maybe part of the discussion is how to say, well, how do we bring nuclear industry in? And you're right, the biggest issue is waste, and there's a lot of different solutions for it. And you know, again, going back to my other comment to Stephen, maybe the funding mechanism should be saying we're going to do research funding on what to do with nuclear waste. I'm sure we could make it into something useful, but I don't know what it is yet. So
I would certainly hope so.
Okay.
The second question you asked was about carbon markets and uncertainty of pricing.
Yes.
So this is a great one, and I spend quite a bit of time on this. So as you might know, at COP26, that was one of the pieces that came out was an agreement to develop an international mechanism for an international pool, essentially, for carbon markets. We haven't really seen any movement yet. There was a hope that there would be the first set of meetings in June. I don't know if that's been put in the books yet. But what I do know is that uncertainty often drives innovation. Doesn't necessarily drive investment. As a matter of fact, it's the bane of the investor, right? It's the principle of uncertainty, but it does drive innovation. We are seeing a huge flood of developers of carbon projects all over the world, both nature-based and technology-based. There are also first movers, very, very wealthy corporations that are willing to pay for various innovations right now at several hundred, I think $400 a ton was the price I saw. A few companies like Shopify went out to buy credits from ClimateWorks and other places, really good to help fund their initial operations, essentially, in order to drive that innovation that's incredibly necessary. So I see the carbon market as, I think that we're going to see carbon barons the way we saw oil barons in the early 1900s. I think that is an absolute possibility. It might be different, that it won't be individuals, it'll be large institutions, but I expect that to happen. Quite frankly, I thought that was going to happen when Kyoto first came about, but of course, we all know what happened with the political blunder on that. But I do think that that's what we're going to see happen here. The variety of projects is really exciting, and the various technologies that are able to develop them and monetize them and craft them is going to be equally important. What we need is an internationally accepted registered body that can ensure that each credit is, the standards are clean, and that the auditing and the assurance and the verification of those is much easier. Because the big roadblock that most of these projects have, if you want to get verified emissions, is it's very costly to continually do the audit, the validation, and verification.
I'm silently smiling here because my wife's father worked for an organization called Lloyd's Register of Shipping. And Lloyd's Register of Shipping was set up as an independent third-party organization to verify that ships all over the world were built to a certain standard. And that allowed them to be insured, it allowed them to travel, allowed people to use them. And they were independent of Lloyd's. I mean, they started off as an offshoot, but they became independent. And Nos Veritas has a similar mandate, and others as well. But it absolutely became the gold standard for measuring these things, and run by good engineering disciplines. They charge fees for service, but they were independent of the financial decision makers that they're going to use that data. So that might be an interesting model for addressing that issue, but I think it's really important. I have one more question that I certainly want to let Ali ask another one. How do we change, and maybe this is more putting your professor hat on, how do we change the dialogue in the community around these issues? Because I'm going back to a question that was asked earlier about the fact that we seem to be, polarizing on some of these issues. How can we, I mean, I really like your case for the business and the investment, and I really like you doing something to solve this issue. So I think that's fantastic. But I don't think most people, I don't think we're embracing people in the dialogue. And if we want to make the type of transition that you envisage, Stephen envisaged, that Ali envisages, how can we change the dialogue?
It's an excellent question. So my mother said to me many times when I was young, some of the people, some of the time, and all of the people, none of the time. And it is more true today, I think, than ever. We do live in a more polarized society than ever, I think, at least from what I can remember. We also live in an ever increasing frequency of pendulum swing. And the way I think about it is, you know, if the pendulum used to swing like this, it now swings further and stays up longer and so on. And so we have greater difficulty. So I keep asking myself, what do we have to do to add weight to the bottom of the pendulum so that it'll sort of come back and down? And it tends to be a notion of the proportion of people that you can get to hold on to this. So I think there's a few ways of doing it. Number one is we have to be brutally honest and optimistic. We have not been honest. Even the IPCC's reports are politically, they're shaped by political ideologies and political agreements. And so you get, it sounds very negative to say the lowest common denominator, but essentially you do, right? So we need to I think, first overcome the fact that that we haven't been fully transparent with people about what's actually coming and what's actually happening. That's number one. Number two, I think we have to shape a conversation that includes people based on subject matter that are important to them. So when I was at PwC, people would ask me all the time, how do you sell to this company and how would you sell to that company? And the answer always was, or the proposition of sustainability, you need to speak in the language that they understand. And it's crazy to think this, but there are now, and I think there actually is one at York, if I'm not mistaken, there are master's degrees in climate communication, right? How do you boil that key message down to something that people can understand? It's easy to digest, not a tagline, because taglines I think can be very dangerous, but a key message or a series of key messages that people can understand. But I think there's no use fighting. So something else that people ask me all the time, like, how will you convince this person or how will you convince that person? I don't often spend my time anymore. I used to spend all of my time preaching the business case for sustainability. I've been doing this for 25 years. And I can't tell you the number of meetings that I had and people would say, get out of here. You have no idea what you're talking about. We're going to be fine. And those same people, 5-10 years later, banging on the door, begging for help. I think sometimes time is the greatest arbiter. And perhaps I just hope that we don't run out of it before many those folks who have their hands on the levers have that realization.
Sure. I mean, Cindy just posted a question. I kind of think you answered it, which was, how do we understand the needs of stakeholders and their viewpoints so we can communicate to each in their own language? So yeah, I've
actually got a framework that I could share with Cindy on how that I teach in my course on stakeholder engagement and how you identify their priorities and determine the issues of interest to them. So
that would be fantastic.
I can send that with you.
If you can send it to us and we'll post it. I think the thing that this is, I mentioned right at the beginning that Ali and I have to have a debrief after all of this and talk about what else we do. But certainly, maybe we can offer some workshops on just exactly that. I mean, I'm sure some people want to do master's degrees in these areas, but sometimes just workshops where you have people with different backgrounds in the room and a useful framework, I think will help on the.
I'll tell you a watch out. No, the worst thing you can do is make it too successful. Al Gore did the greatest favor and the worst favor to climate change. He brought so many people into the conversation and he educated so many people, but he also, because he was a political figure, he more deeply politicized and polarized the issue. So we want to be successful, but we want to do it through anti-mass media, perhaps. I don't have a term.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think part of the motivation behind this speaker series is to say universities have an important role to play in this. And in fact, that's the whole motivation behind the Stronach competition that we're running and all of those other things. It was, if academics and universities come and if we manage the interaction so we can have people of competing influences, but challenge them on the science, then that's great. So, you know, I mean, one of my colleagues who presented earlier told me, you know, I made my point about nuclear power, and he went off at a tangent about stuff about nuclear power. And I'm going to say I agree to disagree with him. But the point that you're making in nuclear power, how do we make responsible managed waste, is absolutely a very valid one. I was involved in that discussion in the UK 30, 40 years ago. So it's a massive issue, one we haven't spent enough attention on. So
and also safe from attack. I mean,
yeah. Safe from Russians, you should say. Safe from Russians.
Russians or whomever it's going to be.
So thank you so much for your time today. Ali,
my pleasure.
Do you want to ask any other questions, or are we just kind of getting? I know we're running out of time, and I'm sorry I talked too long. So
no problem. It was very interesting conversation, and I enjoyed that. Thank you, Nelson, for a great insight and good presentation. I have just one question, and with that, I think I stop further questions. And that is about you rightly mentioned about those decarbonization 3 R's, reduction, replacement, and removal. Among those, my question is about what is the level or distribution of these efforts or measures in terms of, because I think this is important, especially for technology development, to understand what is the current status of each of these R's, and which one you think are probably more in short-term, long-term beneficial, or let's say feasible. Thank you.
Sure. So I'm going to disappoint you with this answer, because truth is I don't know the actual numbers. It's a little piece of work that I'm asking a summer intern to work on, because I want to have that information. But I'll tell you a couple of trends that I have seen. If you start from one side and work your way across to replacement, or pardon me, to removal, the CapEx grows for the most part, right? If we're talking about the technology side, not nature-based, but technology side, it gets more capital intensive. As you can imagine, a large carbon capture and storage facility is more expensive than a solar farm, and that's more expensive than a more efficient motor or HVAC unit or ground source heat pump or so that's one trend that certainly we've seen. The second that we have seen is that the distribution right now seems to very heavily favor work inefficiency, and I think it's because it costs less. A lot of it can be technology, SaaS and AI driven, which is very hot for investment. And so there's massive demand, a massive fit in terms of investors in that space. So we're seeing a lot of action. Another piece is when you look at the government subsidy and the need for government programs to make certain things viable, again, you swing back over into the removal. If you think about 45Q in the US with this $50, potentially $100 credit for sequestered carbon, that makes those projects much more viable. It's one of the reasons that Carbon Engineering is developing their project with Occidental down in Texas, I believe it is, right? So I'm sorry I don't have the numbers for you. I hope to have that by the end of the summer, presuming this intern that I'm looking forward to saddling with this project to come out with those insights.
Thank you very much. Thank you.